So I should first of all thank Suresh, who, when I was writing this book, sent notes. I was expecting, normally when you send something, an unfinished manuscript to a friend, you expect sort of half a page of sort of overview. Suresh sent back about 5 pages of dense bibliographic references and brilliant critical comments, which took about 3 weeks to go through. I don't know if I ever told you this. There was so much in there that it wiped out almost a month of my life just trying to add the brilliant ideas that you came up with, which have totally changed the shape of the book. And if anyone wants to, after this lecture, wants to see visual incarnation of the ideas in this book, you need to go no further than the British Museum, which is a 15-minute walk from here, and see Suresh and Shushma's wonderful show, the Ancient India show, which is just a thing of wonder, and gave me huge pleasure. I wrote a rave review very wholeheartedly in the Observer 3 weeks ago, and I would strongly recommend all of you to go there. Also to buy a copy of Suresh's remarkable Tropical Turn, which is his first book. It's just won and yet another prize this week, bringing it up to about 6, isn't it, or 7 or something that it's won since it came out. Anyway, it's a remarkable book. India is one of those countries in the world which very early on in its history came up with profound answers to the basic questions that humanity asked of itself. Why are we here? How do you live a moral life? How do we understand this world in which we're placed? What's the relationship of this world to the stars, the heavens, to the moon? It wasn't, of course, the only place in the world that came up with early and profound answers. And ancient Greece and ancient China, for example, came up with extraordinary answers of their own around similar sorts of time frames as India was coming up with its. The difference, I think, is that while Europe's ideas are widely taught and have been tom-tommed around the world by the colonial process, the planting of European colonies all over the world, particularly British colonies, all of which taught a very Eurocentric version of history. And while I think China has been very good at projecting its relationship with the world and its seminal contributions through this idea of the Silk Road, which is now such a common idea. Last summer, not only the British Museum, but also the British Library, where we are gathered today, both had Silk Road exhibitions. And there have been many similar books, similar exhibitions, and at one point there were about 40 books a year being written with Silk Road in the title. It's therefore something of a shock to discover that that phrase actually has no ancient precedent. The Silk Road is not something referred to by Marco Polo, any Roman source, or any ancient Chinese source. In fact, it was only invented in 1877 by a German geographer called Baron von Richthofen. Those of you who went to English schools might have come across Richthofen, the Red Baron, the fighter ace who shot down many British Sopwith camels over the trenches in the First World War. The Red Baron was the grandson of the man who came up with the idea of the Silk Road. And the idea first entered the English language in 1936, with Sven Hedden's travels being translated with that title into English. And it was only really in the 1980s when the Met Museum and the National Gallery in Washington both held major shows centered around this and the idea of the trade networks of ancient China, that this idea became popular. And it became popular for a very good reason, because it's a very sexy idea. It works at every level. Everyone likes the idea of Bactrian camels crossing over the Himalayas and swinging down into the Gobi Desert. And it works at the level of a museum show. It works at the level of a Netflix series, Marco Polo with some Mongol princess. It works as a geopolitical idea. And indeed, it has changed the geopolitical shape of the world, as the Chinese have over the last 20, 25 years, built the Belt and Road on its model. But it is not an idea that has any ancient consequences, any ancient precedent. It is an invented Victorian idea. And it's an idea which minimizes India. As this map, taken at random from many of the 40-odd books published last year with Silk Road in the title. Literally, I went to a bookshop, took one out, and took this photo. And in this map, as you can see, India not only has no towns, it has no ports. And the maritime route which dots around its coast doesn't stop in India because there are no ports. The action this map implies is to the north. The real east-west motorway was between ancient ports like Gaza, Tyre, Antioch, Palmyra, and Loyang, with all these wonderful Persian and Central Asian names in between. Hamadan, Baghdad, Merv, Samarkand, Tashkent. They're incredibly romantic and resonant. But the idea that there was an ancient east-west motorway that always connected the China Sea with the Mediterranean is, to put it frankly, bollocks. There is no evidence whatsoever that any Chinese merchant or diplomat ever made it to the Roman world. There is no evidence that any Roman diplomat or trader ever made it to China. There is evidence that both had vague rumors of the other. In China, there are references to somewhere called Daquin that seems to be this great power in the West. And similarly, in the Periplus, the best trading manual that survives from the ancient Roman world, looking at the East, there is mention of a city called Thebes, which is far away and difficult to get to, which is where silk comes from. So there's both directions a vague notion of something beyond that they've heard of. But the idea that there's a trading route is nonsense. That does not really begin in any realistic sense until the Mongols punch a hole through the middle of Asia. Genghis Khan wipes out every kingdom between the Mediterranean and the South China Sea. And in 1271, Marco Polo does indeed travel from Jerusalem along that dotted line, ending up in Kublai Khan's Xanadu or Shangtu, to deliver a phial of oil from the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem to Kublai Khan. So, what of India? Well, India, there may be no evidence that China and Rome were ever in contact, but India and Rome were not only in contact, not only knew of each other's existence, but we know from classical sources that they had such an important and an intimate trading relationship that according to Strabo, 250 vessels a year set off from the Red Sea coast of, we've got a pointer here, yeah, from the Red Sea coast of the Red Sea here, and went down this dotted line to Barbaricum at the, where Karachi is now, the port of the Indus, Baragaza in Gujarat, and Muziris in Kerala. And Pliny, another contemporary from the 1st century, he dies when Vesuvius goes off in AD 79. So before that, he writes that India is the drain of all the precious metals in the world. In other words, in a rather sort of Trumpian sentiment, that all our money is going eastwards, which is why, in another Trumpian move, the Romans put up literally 30% tariffs on the Red Sea boundary and demand that everyone pays a 30% customs charge on all the Eastern luxuries. So, on one hand, we have an idea of a Silk Road which never existed, certainly before the 13th century. And on the other, we have a completely forgotten maritime trade route, which brought enormous prosperity both to Rome and to, well, more particularly prosperity to India, and brought a great drain of Roman gold into Indian pockets. And it's a very good example of how groupthink can affect historians, how everyone can echo each other year after year with an idea which simply has no basis in fact, or to extend an idea which is true, which is the later Middle Ages, or the Middle Ages onwards, back into a period in history when it's no longer tenable and no longer works. So over the next 40 minutes, I hope to show you that it's India, not China, which was the main hub of trade and ideas in the ancient world, in the classical period, and that the mode of transport was not over land, but over seas. And I call this the Golden Road, because it brought the gold first from the Roman world to the west coast of India, and then later on there's a pivot after the fall of Rome when Roman gold no longer arrives in India. And from the 5th century onwards, after the fall of Rome, Indian merchants pivot eastwards and look for that missing gold in Suvarnabhumi, the lands of gold to the east, by which they mean modern Burma, Java, the islands of Indonesia, the Khmer world of Cambodia, and the whole Srivijaya, the whole Indonesian archipelago. And there are endless references in the Jataka stories and indeed in the Ramayana about the riches, the gold that can be found if you only travel east. So, along those trade routes, Indian ideas also traveled. And over the course of 1,200 years, behind Indian merchants, you have the spread of Indian ideas. Huge swathes of the world had their trajectory significantly altered or completely transformed by those Indian ideas. And I group them in the book under 3 main headings. First of all, the ideas of the Buddha, Buddhism, the ideas of how to avoid suffering, and how to live your life in a moral way that the Buddha came up with, which is not much talked about in India because there are very few Buddhists left in India, and even after the arrival of Tibetan refugees. Buddhism almost died out in India, but it is the most successful Indian idea ever in terms of diffusion, certainly religious ideas. And the spread of Buddhism completely changed the shape and nature of Asian society to the east of it forever. Then, at the same time as this pivot eastwards happens with the trade, you get the spread with it of Sanskrit, Sanskrit literature, ideas of Hindu kingship and ideas of Hinduism, and Hindu art, architecture, dance, music, a whole spread of Hindu-related arts and learning, which takes root all over Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia becomes in many ways an extension of the learning and the culture of India. The third idea is the idea of mathematics. In this country, anyone that goes through the British education system will know about the work of Archimedes shouting Eureka in his bath, probably by your 5th, 6th birthday. You know about Pythagoras and his theorem by maybe your 8th or your 9th birthday. But no one in this country, unless they are of South Asian heritage, which so many in this room are, so it doesn't quite work in this room as well as it would do anywhere else in the country, but no one who is not of South Asian heritage has ever heard of Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta, comparable figures to Archimedes and Pythagoras, who came up with remarkable mathematical and astronomical ideas. Aryabhatta comes up not only with the exact circumference of the Earth and the exact distance of the Earth to the moon, he also comes up with the fact that we live in a heliocentric universe, that this Earth revolves around the sun 1,000 years before Galileo realized it in the West. Brahmagupta comes up with the idea of zero, by which I mean zero had existed as the space between positive and negative numbers, or indeed just as a placeholder, since Babylonian times. But Brahmagupta realizes that it's a number with its own powers, that he produces a definition of zero, that it's the number you get when you subtract a number from itself, for example. No, I'm saying it that way around. We'll ask questions at the end, sir. Okay. Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, between them, effectively come up with the number system, which is, in many ways, India's greatest gift to the world. The idea that you can have 9 digits and 0, which between them provide the ability to formulate any number up to infinity, is an idea very obvious to us once we've invented it. But it is one of the great conceptual leaps of mankind. And without that, we'd all still be sitting here trying to give our phone numbers by saying MCV, XV, CCM, CC, XV, VV, XV, CCM, and then try doing long multiplication with Roman numbers. It's a massive and huge leap. And again, no one in this country is taught that this idea comes from India. In this country, as in most of Western Europe, we call it the Arabic number system, because Europe gets it from the Arabs, but the Arabs get it from the Indians. That's the bit that is not taught. And how that number system traveled first to the Arabs in the Middle East, and from the Arabs in the Middle East to Western Europe is the subject of the final part of my lecture. So, as concerns the Silk Road, if the Silk Road were true, you'd expect to see Roman coins moving across that world from the Roman ports of Gaza, Tyre, Antioch, Palmyra, and Alexandria, and spreading eastwards to the South China Sea. Do you? Well, last year, the Oxford Archaeological Department at Oxford University actually formulated a map where they showed every single place that had ever been discovered more than 50 Roman coins in one place. And this is the map. Does it have that line across it as you'd expect if this was a true theory? This is what it looks like in reality. As you'd expect, most Roman coins are there in Western Europe, in Italy, France, Gaul, southern Britain. There's a little rim around the Mediterranean. There's another rim around the Black Sea. There's a little tail going down the Nile. Then beyond, a couple of little orange dots around Aden. Few dots in Afghanistan, where the Kushans traded with Rome. Not one Roman coin hoard has ever been found in China. Not one. But look at India and Sri Lanka. The whole coast is rimmed with yellow, with orange. So that's the reality of the reach of Roman coins and the shape of ancient trade projected onto a map. It's a very different picture to this myth that we've been fed for the last 40 years. So, the ideas that travel alongside this. First of all, Buddhism. So, well, the first thing to be said about Buddhism is that the Buddha was almost certainly a historical character. He lived as you and I live. He lived in the mid-5th century BCE. What's fascinating, though, is that there's very little evidence of the spread of Buddhist ideas for the first 200 years. Buddhism, for its first 200 years, remains where the Buddha lived, which was born in Lumbini, just over the Nepalese border, enlightened in Bodh Gaya, now in the heart of Bihar, and gives his first sermon just outside Varanasi at Sarnath. And that area between Bihar and UP and the Nepalese border remains the limits of Buddhism for its first period. There are a few arguments about whether there are some signs of Buddhism on southern Sri Lanka a little bit earlier, and so on, but basically it remains a North Indian phenomenon of the Gangetic Plains. And then Ashoka. And it's Ashoka that changes everything. Ashoka converts to Buddhism in 250 BCE, and he sends out what he calls Dharma ministers, in our language, missionaries, to spread his faith. And he seems to be focused particularly in the sources on the West, because remember, Alexander had just died in Babylon, leaving his kingdom orphaned. His generals, Antiochus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy, fight over the remains of the empire. And we know from an Ashoka inscription in Kandahar that Dharma ministers were sent as far west as Cyrene, which is modern Libya. But what we don't notice so much is that it also, of course, went down through India. There's only very tentative evidence of the spread of Buddhism outside the Gangetic Plains to, for example, the Western Ghats, where in 150 AD, 100 years after Ashoka, you start to get these incredible rock-cut monasteries like Baja outside Pune. And in this, you have a representation of early Indian architecture in wood and bamboo, which is now lost. Our only indications of what it used to look like is this. And everyone's in little apartments. Look, it looks like they've got an apartment. We've got some couples looking on their balconies outside. This is what ancient India must have looked like, but we have no idea of it in the archaeological record because bamboo and wood do not survive, except leaving tiny traces of post holes. But here we have a representation of what it might have looked like. We also get the early Buddhist wall paintings, of which the most famous are Ajanta. This is from Cave 1. This actually dates from 650 AD, but there are other, 500 AD, but there are other early Buddhist paintings in Ajanta which date from 150 AD. And particularly the other great success of the Ashoka period is the spread of Buddhism to Sri Lanka. And we see that Mahinda, son of Ashoka, and his sister go to Sri Lanka, and there they convert the king of Anuradhapura to the Buddhist faith. And from that moment, Sri Lanka becomes the center of the Buddhist mission. We have just discovered Mahinda's stupa on the hill of Rajagala in central Sri Lanka with a Brahmi inscription a couple of years ago. We have this wonderful image of the Bodhisattva. And in the centuries which follow, this miracle takes place, which should be taught in every Indian school and every school in the world, because it's one of the most extraordinary spread of ideas, one of the most extraordinary transformations thanks to ideas in human history. Most ideas travel with armies. When the British come to India, they conquer India and they teach their ideas in schools. But this does not spread with armies. This does not spread with the sword or with the jackboot or with spears. It spreads through the sheer power of its ideas, which is very rare in human history. This is an empire of the spirit. So as well as the southernmost thrust down to Ajanta and down to Sri Lanka, another thrust of the Buddhist mission is through Pakistan, Gandhara, Afghanistan, and Bactria. Another route through Lhasa, through Dunhuang up to Mongolia and Siberia. A third thrust through Chang'an to Korea and Japan. Another down through Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, as far as the Philippines. And this still, the resonance of this spread of ideas, still today changes everything about these countries. When you go to Sri Lanka or Siam or Thailand or Cambodia, you still find Buddhist monks wandering around. You still encounter stupas and roadside shrines that reflect this. But what's important to realize is that the Buddhist mission does not just lead to the spread of religious ideas. With it come languages, Sanskrit and Prakrit, and access to Indian literature. With it comes ideas of geography, ideas of Jambudvipa, the idea of the world centered on Mount Meru. With it comes idea of time, Indian ideas of circular time, yugas, and so on. This spreads around the world with the Buddhist mission. And to this day, we are coming across new evidence of the spread of Buddhism to places we didn't know it went. So in the middle of me writing this book, when I was just about to finish the first draft, this turned up, which is an extraordinary and beautiful head of the Buddha, which turns up where? In a temple to the goddess Isis in ancient Egypt, on the Red Sea coast. And the form of the Buddha's head looks like a North Indian or Gandharan Buddha, but it's in white Peloponnesian marble from the Marmara Sea. The Buddha has, as the archaeologists nicely called it, in his tortellini curls are drilled with a drill that is only used in Alexandria. So this was made in Alexandria, presumably by Egyptian craftsmen. But they were familiar enough with the idea of the Buddha and the iconography of the Buddha to come up with this perfect Buddha. And then there are these sun rays. What's that about? Is that a cross with some solar cult, with Mithras or Sol Invictus or Surya? Anyway, this shows, which we didn't know before, that there was a great familiarity with the Buddha and his ideas in ancient Roman, or rather in Roman Egypt. And by the 1st century AD, we get this extraordinary book, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, on which this map is based. Now, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but it is only the Lonely Planet or the rough guide of its day. It is literally the rough guide for Roman sailors traveling to India. And the fact that there was a need for that implies that there's a market for it, that people are passing this information between each other. And where is it? So we're talking here, Mussel Harbour, Myos Hormuz, and Berenike, where that Buddha head came from. This is where Strabo says the big fleet of 250 vessels set off for, but the archaeological evidence is that Berenike is even bigger. And so maybe we're talking 500 ships or 600 ships a year coming down this route. They come down the Red Sea, past Meroe and Agilis, and that's why we get in Indian, this is Amaravati, we have this Ethiopian figure. Look at him with his long sword, his page boys with their cornrow hair, offering gifts to an Indian ruler. So Ethiopia is part of this route. And they come out past Aden, and then they have a choice of all these very different ports on the West Africa. Sorry, making a mess of this. They have a choice of all these different ports on the West Indian coast. And they have, the writer of this, the Roman writer of this guide, has an intimate knowledge of each of those ports. He says, for example, that that there's a great market for Roman castrati singing boys in Barigaza, that the king of Gujarat likes to buy singing boys. So if you're going to Barigaza, pack a hold full of these guys. What's also useful is just to see the scale of the Tibetan plateau, because that is what creates this trade. Every winter, it freezes over and cold winds blow in. Every summer, it thaws and warm winds blow out. And that bellows action every 6 months creates the monsoon winds. And the monsoon winds mean that if you're an ancient Indian sailor in, say, Muziris, you only have to put up your sail and you blow in 2 months at speed with like a sort of, turbocharged by the monsoon, right across here and right up here. You then have about 4 months to go get to the Nile, get to Alexandria, sell your goods, go and see the pyramids, go and visit a show. We have a Roman novel where an Indian chieftain goes to see the games in Alexandria. He has a house in Alexandria. And then get back to the Red Sea, catch the wind, and then by the end of the year, you're back home in Kerala or Gujarat or Sindh. So we have in the classical sources and in the archaeology an intimate knowledge of this trade route, which scholars have never forgotten about, but which somehow has failed to make it beyond the ivory towers into the popular conception of what's going on, with an intimate to and fro between Rome and ancient India. While, as I said, the only mention in the Periplus of China is that Thebes. Somewhere to the east, there is a city called Thebes, which is hard to get to. Now, this is an important new find, the Muziris Papyrus, and economic historians are thrilled with this because it gives them figures, it gives them data. And the Muziris Papyrus is just a shipping invoice of the sort which is made out in Mumbai port or Cochin every day. And it contains 3 columns, just like a modern shipping invoice. The goods, the price, and the customs due at the far end. And the big surprise is that Indians were basically ripping off my Roman forebears, if I had any, and overcharging for these Indian luxury products. Now, what were these Indian products? Well, we know what they are because not only are they in the Muziris Papyrus, they're also in this lovely Roman mosaic in Sicily, which is presumably erected by some merchant who was part of this trade. What it shows is a personification of India, which seems to be closely based on a yakshi, a Kushan yakshi, of which you can find some very good examples in the BM show. Now, the point of a yakshi is that she's a fertility spirit, an embodiment of fertility, which is why she's sensuous and busty, but also why she's touching a tree and why the tree is blossoming. The minute she touches the tree, it bursts into flower. Now, the Roman didn't understand it. They got the busty bit, But they, but they didn't get the fact that the tree's meant to burst into flowers, so the tree's just sitting there. But she is a deliberately sensuous figure. And what's fascinating is, what is she wearing? She's wearing silk. And the Periplus tells us clearly that Romans got their silk not from China, but from India. So if ever there was a meeting of China and Rome, it's probable that it took place in Muziris, or in Barigaza, or in Barbaricum, on the quays of one of these Indian ports. That's where Chinese merchants or Sogdian missionaries, Sogdian middlemen, most likely intermediaries, would bring silk. And what's fascinating is that this image of silk plays into what Pliny says about silk. And Pliny is a sort of hyper-conservative old buffer. And he doesn't like all the money from Rome gushing into Indian pockets. And he blames the liberals in the city. He's a rough, tough sailor, and he regards these decadent women in Rome as part of the problem. And he says they love turning up to parties almost naked. You can see all their bits through the silk. And here we have, indeed, her leg clearly visible through the silk. And sort of Pliny regards silk as sort of porno wear, as sort of Victoria's Secret, sort of dirty knickers or something. And he talks about how these Roman ladies insist on wearing it, and you can see everything. And he has a point, because we actually know from other sources about, for example, Lolina Paulina, who was Nero's mistress, who turned up in silk with all her stuff showing through. And she wore diamonds in her hair, Indian garnets in her tummy button, Indian pearls on her shoes, and in a nice Punjabi touch, brought the receipts to parties to show people how much it cost. So it's not just the Delhi wedding where people leave the labels on with that expensive Sabyasachi dupatta, whatever. This is an old tradition of this part of the world. But there's not just silk, there's also pepper hanging here, ivory, major Indian export in the Muziris Paris, and circus animals. These are not just sort of Disney animals as they look. These are being exported for sale in the Colosseum and the great circuses. And this, I wonder, could this be Malabathrum, which was the other big Indian export, along with nard, material for perfumery? So this is rather like the kind of Indian first century equivalent of a duty-free shop where you get stuck when British Airways cancels your flight in Heathrow, and you end up buying that expensive Indian whiskey or the Hermes scent you can't afford. And Romans clearly had sort of, buyer's remorse the next day when they saw the bill in the Muziris Papyrus for all the stuff. But what's fascinating about this is it shows the 30% cut that the Roman authorities are taking on all this. And economic historians are now suggesting that possibly as much as a quarter of the entire Roman imperial budget came from the customs take on the Red Sea coast. That this was a much more important part of the Roman budget. It was in effect a form of income tax, because in the era before income tax existed, you're taxing luxury imports. So only the rich are affected. So it's quite a clever way of raising money. We shouldn't tell this to Trump, but it's quite a clever way of raising money for your government. As a result of all this, we have luxury Indian products turning up in Pompeii, but we also have luxury Alexandrian Egyptian products turning up here in Afghanistan. So here we've got 3 very fancy Alexandrian glass beakers, painted with an image of Russell Crowe on the left in Gladiator. Incidentally, going back, this is Gladiator 2. Remember that moment when the rhino turns up? This is where it came from. Anyway, we've got Russell Crowe, we've got the famous Alexandrian lighthouse, and we've got the wine harvest. And we also have hints that there's iconography passing. So it's difficult to tell which direction this is going. But here's an image of Christ and his disciples on a Coptic papyrus, very similar to this image of the Buddha and his disciples, which turns up in the north of Gandhara, just over near Kashgar, near Yarkand, in Miran, dug up by Aurel Stein in the 1920s. And the biggest, most important effect of this, and this was something we were talking about with Suresh yesterday in the shows, is this where the idea of showing the Buddha in human form comes. Because before Roman art was being looked at and coming in beakers and metalware and fancy imports from Rome, the Buddha was depicted aniconically as the wheel of law or a stupa or a flaming pillar. But suddenly, and this is from Suresh's show, the Bimaran reliquary suddenly shows the Buddha in a toga, very much in a kind of Roman form. Now, as we were discussing yesterday, there's another derivation of the iconography, of the human iconography of the Buddha from yakshas and these early yaksha cults around Mathura. But it certainly seems to have been that in Gandhara there's the influence of classical art, because by the 3rd and 4th century, we're getting these very classical faces that look like Roman emperors on the faces of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. The guy on the right literally could come walked out of the forum. And indeed, here is Augustus coming straight out of the forum in his toga. And look how like the drapery is between the two. They're both exactly contemporary, 2nd century statues, and one clearly influencing the other. So it is in a hybrid sort of Romano-Indic form that you go up to Afghanistan now as we pass northwards along the trade routes. It passed Mezainak, which is an important new site in Afghanistan. Mezainak built, incidentally, on top of a copper deposit. And this is an important point, because we often have this very sort of otherworldly view of Buddhism as this sort of otherworldly religion. In reality, the Buddhist monks are being supported by and are linked with the traders. The monasteries are often placed next to copper or iron ore deposits. The monks are lending money as part of their monastic job at interest to passing merchants, and the monasteries become like caravanserais where merchants can rest on their way on these trade routes. And the copper deposit at Mezainak is currently being mined by the Chinese. These are the Chinese barracks recently set up, and the whole thing's going to be blown up soon by the Chinese because they want to get to the copper beneath it. So we have to think of this not in otherworldly sort of Hollywood Tibet sort of form with floating lamas and things, but these monks were very worldly wise. And through the trade routes, we see Buddhism pass through Bamiyan, up into China, where the Buddha begins to look a little bit more Chinese while still wearing Gandharan outfits, and into Western China, into Gansu. And by the 3rd, 4th century, Gupta images, this is from Mathura, of the Bodhisattva with lovely belly button and a kind of pajama string here, is being copied more crudely in China. You're finding Ajanta-like images of heavenly beings, Gadavras and Apsaras flying over the domes of monasteries like Kizil. The monks seem to be smoking something quite strong here, judging by the flames coming out of this guy. And that's actually a psychedelic blue elephant. But anyway, by the 5th century, Buddhism has reached the Chinese court and is competing with Taoism and Confucianism as a major religion. And the Confucians and the Taoists take this as an outside competitor religion. And they say this isn't something Chinese, this is something Indian, this is something from outside, it's a barbarian religion. So you begin to get tension at court. And it's while there is a bit of an outbreak of that tension at the beginning of the Tang dynasty that this man leaves China for India. This is Xuanzang. The older among you who went to school long ago would have understood him as Xuanzang, as he used to be written. Well, Xuanzang, same guy, represented by his backpack full of scrolls, you can always tell him in murals, and with this little torch hanging to wander in the night, set off to try and find two things from India. He wanted the original Yogacara texts, which are not available in China, and he also wanted the Buddhist Vinaya monastic rules, which he thought were corrupted in translation and had now been falsified. He can't get them in China. He travels all over looking for them, so he decides to walk to India to get them from where? The center of intellectual Buddhism, which is where? Nalanda, the University of Nalanda. So he crosses the Pamirs. He gets robbed twice. He nearly gets sacrificed to Durga on Durga Puja, literally. It's a lovely story. He goes into a trance and asks that he be allowed to meditate one last time. And while he is locked in meditation, this big dust storm blows up and the winds start blowing around. And all the brigands who've captured him and about to sacrifice him are worried that they've offended some deity. And they sort of bow down. So when he wakes up from his meditation, he finds all the brigands sitting down, begging forgiveness. And anyway, he makes it to Nalanda. Now, again, this audience, unusually for an audience in this country, will know all about Nalanda. Most people in this country don't. But look, just quickly, look at the courtyard. Look at the cloister. Look at the rooms around the cloister. Where do you see that today? Oxford and Cambridge. It is the exact model of a Western university. And you can make a very good case that this way of organizing a scholarly institution starts with the Buddhist monasteries in India and Central Asia, spreads through Central Asia to Persia, where it becomes the model for the early madrasas, through North Africa, through Islamic Spain. And where do we get the first universities in the West in the 11th and 12th century? Salerno, Bologna, Paris, on the edge of Islamic Spain, and then Oxford and Cambridge in the 12th century. But the thing that most excites Xuanzang is the library at Nalanda. 9 stories tall. 3 divisions, the Ratnadadi, the Ratnasagara, the Ratnaranjaka, the Jewel Adorned, the Sea of Jewels, and the Ocean of Jewels. The priests, the number of several thousands, engage in discussions. The old and young mutually help each other. The students study diligently without wasting a moment. The atmosphere of the monastery is solemn and dignified. Xuanzang is like that kid that gets into Harvard and then can't resist to tell all his friends about how exciting it is. And he's just completely thrilled by it. And we know that this was a big deal. This is a copper tablet now in the National Museum in Delhi, which tells about an endowment made by the king of Srivijaya, Indonesia, to found a college at Nalanda for the use of Southeast Asian monks. So just as today you get the Mahinda Humanities Center at Harvard, founded by a man who makes jeeps in India, so you get in Nalanda the king of Srivijaya setting up a place for Southeast Asian monks. And it wasn't just Srivijaya. We know that monks came from Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, and even Korea. So this is a big deal. So eventually, Xuanzang, for 20 years, copies out manuscripts in this library. And when he gets back to China, the Emperor Taizong builds a copy of the Nalanda Library. This is what we think it may have looked like from a seal. And it looks surprisingly like the Wild Goose Pagoda, which still stands in Xi'an, which was built by Taizong to house Xuanzang's manuscripts. And here is Taizong. Here is his son, Gaizong, who succeeds him. And this is the woman who has a lot to answer for. Now, she doesn't look like much in this picture. I hope I'm not being sexist by saying that. But she looks a lot better in the Chinese soap opera based on her life. And you get the idea of what's going on. So in short, I've dwelt on it in salacious detail in the book, because there are only so many pages on Buddhist manuscripts that you can really take without a bit of sauce in between. But here she is. She enters the harem of Taizong, age 15. And at some point, as the old man is dying, she seems to have jumped into the bed of Gaizong and certainly made quite an impression on him, shall we say. Because after he dies and she and all the other wives and queens and concubines are put in a nunnery, Gaizong fishes her out after a year and makes her first chief concubine, then empress, and then he has a stroke and she becomes the regent. And finally, when he dies, she becomes the only woman emperor in 3,000 years of Chinese history. And the first thing she does to back up her power is to kick out the Confucians and the Taoists who think that women are inferior, and she makes the religion of the court Buddhism. Now, she does this for very clear ulterior motives, because the Buddhist monks begin to fake prophecies that she is an incarnation of Maitreya. All sorts of bollocks is cooked up. But it means that this is the high point of Indian influence in China in the whole of world history. Never again will India be so influential. And just like Brexit takes place, because we have these sinister Tory think tanks in Tufton Street and Smith Square, so Wu Zetian has her sinister think tank called the Scholars of the Northern Gate, staffed with Nalanda-trained monks, not all of whom are Indian, some of whom are Chinese, like Yi Jing. Anyway, these guys bolster her rule, and this is, in the 660s, the high point in all of history of Indian influence in China. Never again will Indians be so powerful in China and so influential. And again, remember, with Buddhism comes Sanskrit, Prakrit. You end up with Indian astronomers running the Astronomy Bureau in Xi'an. Whole range of important government jobs are given over to Indians. And many of the Chinese who are ruling are trained in Nalanda. So this is a forgotten moment, peak India in Xi'an. But it coincides with a peak moment for India in Southeast Asia. Now, we talked earlier about the incredible amount of gold coming from Rome to India during the Roman period. Now, obviously, the fall of Rome is a catastrophe for India. Suddenly, that's just shut off. Berenike is abandoned. Myos Hormos is abandoned. There are no ports, sailing even. On top of that, in the period just before the closure, there is during the reign of Justinian, during the wars with Persia, the Sasanian Persians, who are rivals now in the Red Sea and in the Persian Gulf, blockade Byzantine ships from reaching India. And occasionally, if they do reach Sri Lanka, you have squabbles between the Persian merchants and the Roman Greek merchants. So while all this happens, the Tamil trading guilds, the 500s, which Anirudh Kanasetti has written brilliantly about in his book, they are now running the trade, and they pivot eastwards. And where do they look for gold? Bujang, Palembang, Keling, Kutai. Southeast Asia becomes now, for the first time, Savarna Bhumi, the lands of gold. When you go to Bangkok on your holidays, you land at Savarna Bhumi Airport. That's the record of this. Incidentally, when you land in Java, you will possibly travel with Garuda Airlines, which is the national carrier, which is also a record of the transference of Indian ideas at this point. So suddenly, out of Nagapatnam, out of Tamralipti, which is more or less where Calcutta is, and out of Mamallapuram, which is about here, these fleets of Indian ships are catching the monsoon winds with this elaborate new sails and sailing to Southeast Asia. And suddenly in the 5th century, exactly a century after the fall of Rome, we suddenly see the Buddhist chakras in Southeast Asia, lingams, yonis, images of Lord Shiva, Khmer canals, which if you take a putt-putt boat to Angkor Baray on this hill, on that you see the first Hindu temple in Southeast Asia. Inside it, you find these early images of Vishnu. But what's interesting is that from the beginning, these Southeast Asian sculptures of Hindu gods are not the same as you'd find them in India. They have the same iconography, but they're immediately stylistically different. The faces are Khmer faces. They're wearing sampots, which is the Khmer wrap, the Khmer lungi. And there's all sorts of weird stuff going on, like Jayavarman II holding a conch and a discus. Now, you don't find that in Tamil or Pala sculpture. You don't find the king shown as a god. That would be blasphemous. You have Raja Raja Chola with Lord Shiva, but you don't have Raja Raja Chola as Lord Shiva. So all sorts of new things are happening. And this is the beginning. Here we have someone, let's call him Kedunga, to give him an Indonesian tribal name, which appears on one inscription, and a bunch of Indian Brahmins with their Brahmin cords are there with their dreadlocked hair, like sadhus in the Kumbh Mela today, and they're pouring water in the Abhisheka ceremony under a canopy. So Kodunga suddenly becomes, let's say, Suryavarman. He takes a Sanskritic name. Sanskrit becomes the language of government and of culture all the way from Kandahar right through to Bali. And the Khmers are not just, they just take Sanskrit, they are fantastically good at their Sanskrit. It's orthographically perfect, it's grammatically perfect, and they're a bit showy-offy in their inscriptions about all the Hindu texts they're reading. There's lots of quotes and references. And how are they writing it? They're writing it in the Pallava Grantha, or Southern Brahmi script. This is the script. You know how the North Indian script has the straight line, as in Hindi, in Sanskrit, and you have the letters coming down from the line. Well, you can't do that on a palm leaf because you rip the palm. So in South India, you have the curvilinear letters that go round and round and round. And these are the basis of not only Tamil and Malayalam, but also every single script in Southeast Asia. Pew, Mon, Khmer, Thai, and so on. And so South Indian scripts become the basis for the script. Even the rivers are changed. You have yonis and lingams carved into the riverbanks. And the main river in Southeast Asia, it becomes Ma Ganga, or as it's pronounced in the Khmer Empire, Mekong. Mekong. It's just Ma Ganga. Suddenly, temples like the Shore Temple in Mahabalipuram are copied almost exactly, but not entirely exactly. In Java, this is Gedong Songo. Slightly different doors, little Chinese finials on the edge, but more or less the same sort of idea. Then, by the 9th and 10th century, the temples in Southeast Asia start to get bigger than the ones in India. Because while in India you have hundreds of little competing Cholas against Chalukyas, against Pallavas, against, and on it goes, against Chelas and so on. In Southeast Asia, you have two big powers, Srivijaya, which is Indonesia, and the Khmer Empire, which, don't tell Mr. Modi, is probably the largest land empire by any Hindu king ever, which has the whole of Cambodia, the whole of Laos, the whole of Vietnam, and quite a lot of Thailand. And so they start building bigger than in India. So Prambanam is arguably bigger than any 9th or 10th century temple in India. And there you get the first sequence of Ramayana. How many are there in 300? 240, I think. 240 Ramayana images in stone in Prambanan, 300 years before the first sequence in India, which is in Hampi. It's obviously an Indian story, but it's actually sculpted for the first time in complete form. And it reflects the slightly Javanese version of the Ramayana, which is marginally different, with a slightly different ending to some of the Valmiki version. Then you get the largest Buddhist monument, or certainly one of the most sophisticated, at Borobudur, with this wonderful mandala plan rising up from it's like an organ engine of enlightenment. You walk in at the bottom, you're taught the story of the Buddha. Next leg, it's ever more esoteric Buddhist texts until you arrive at the top, and suddenly, like enlightenment, you're there out over the mountains, which you can't see for the first 4 tiers. And then, of course, finally, in the 12th century, the greatest of all Hindu temples is built not in India, but at Angkor Wat. Today, it's a Buddhist temple. Originally, it was a temple to Lord Vishnu. It's absolutely massive. In Greater Angkor, you had 1.2 million people living at a time when London was about 20,000. The outer moat is supposedly encloses an area 4 times the size of the Vatican City. But it's no longer clearly modeled on recognizable Indian forms. All these forms have their roots in Indian architecture, but they've blossomed in new ways. For example, the central tower of the quincunx. Quincunx means the shape of a 5 on the dice. Not a word you get a chance to use often. Very nice word. Shashi would love it if he's here. I don't know where he is. So the central tower of the quincunx contains the ashes of Suryavarman II. Now, I don't think you find that in any Indian temple. You put the ashes normally in a gut or on a chhatri outside the temple. You don't put it in the temple. But here it is in the center, like in a stupa. So when Tagore comes in the 1920s, 30s to Angkor, he says, everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her. So this is also an important part of the story, that what's happening in Southeast Asia is Hindu, it is Indian influenced, but it's not the same Hinduism quite. It's not identical to what's happening. They're developing it and taking it on their own trajectory. So when you go to Bali today, Hinduism there is significantly different from the Hinduism of India. So finally, numbers. 270. Why are we able to read that to this day when we can't really readily read, or have to do a sum before we can read MCXVXVM, which is the Latin equivalent? So the Guptas were serious mathematicians. An important point, it isn't sometimes nationalists in India see in that Sanjeev Bhaskari way everything in India as India. But what you see in the sources is that the Indian intellectuals like Aryabhatta are taking in and reading the ancient sources from Persia, from Babylon, from ancient Egypt. When you go to Ajanta, you see in the murals people that look Roman or Greek or Ethiopian. India is a cosmopolitan center. It's not a sort of Tupperware of sealed Indian nationalism. They're reading what they call the Yavana Sutras. Euclid, maybe, who knows what Greek text was being read. But as today, you make forward movement in science when you take all the ideas of the present, bring them together, and take it 2 steps forward. That's what Aryabhatta is doing. It's not just Vedic mathematics developed. There are new ideas coming in, catalyzing people to think in new ways, and the result is something dramatically different. So here at Udayagiri, near Sanchi, we have the great temple of Udayagiri on the Tropic of Cancer. It has water clocks, sight lines, sundials, all sorts of platforms for astronomy, all sorts of technical, astronomical, astrological things going on. And at the heart of it, we have this image of Varaha arriving out of the flood with Bhudevi, the earth goddess, clinging to his tusk. He's got his feet on the coils of a Naga king, and behind him is one of the great Gupta emperors, maybe Chandragupta II. Now headless, but still showing he's been to the gym, and he's quite a serious bodybuilder. And these Guptas took their learning, spread it over India, and spread it beyond. So that we have the very first dated 0 isn't in India, it's in Cambodia, K172. And there's the first dated 0 in history. And there we get it again, now for the first time with the polo mint shape, the round shape we use today. First time in history that is used that we can date. There's another manuscript in Oxford, the Bakshali manuscript, but scholars are still fighting over the date of it. But this is securely dated to the 9th century. So how does it develop into our numbers today? Well, this is the simple diagram that should be taught in every school in the world, because this letter system is the nearest thing human beings have to universal language. Starts with Brahmi, and by the 1st century, this is the forms. Here is the Gwalior inscription, there's the polo mint. And then it splits in 3 different directions. This is the Sanskrit Devanagari numbers that continued in use in India. As it spreads into the Arab world, we get the Arab numbers, which are used today in Iraq and Egypt and so on. And these are the West Arabic numbers, sometimes called the Gobar numbers, used in Morocco and Islamic Spain, which by the 16th century have become our numbers. How does it get to the Middle East? Well, probably through a Disney character. The story gets stranger still. So I'm sure all of you have sat with children, nephews, nieces, or grandchildren and had to sit through this movie at some point. This is Aladdin, and the villain of Aladdin is Jafar, who has the parrot on his shoulders. Now, he's a real character. He's in the Arabian Nights, and he's not a villain. He's the vizier of Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad at the height of the Abbasid Empire. And the first thing the Barmakid family do when they come to power is to call for the books of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta from Sind. They're brought in 776 to Baghdad, and they are translated. Why do the Barmakids know about these? Because they were Buddhist abbots from Afghanistan before they converted to Islam, and the grandfather, Khalid ibn Barmak, studied higher mathematics in Srinagar in Kashmir. So this is the link between the Indic world and the Arab Islamic world. Here is the Barmakids receiving the books. This is Al-Khwarizmi, who translates successfully for the first time. Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta write in poetry. And in order to memorize it, students are taught to memorize Aryabhatta. But it's almost incomprehensible without multi-volume commentaries. What Al-Khwarizmi does is he successfully unravels all that complexity into very simple Arabic prose. And his translation is more than a translation because he adds to it bits of Euclid, and he brings together Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta into a very clear, simple Arabic prose that any teenager can understand. You don't need volumes of commentary, it's self-referencing. You can just read this as a 14 or 15-year-old and understand higher mathematics. And the book that he writes to do this is called The Compendious Book of Calculating by Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculation. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful even today. In English, you should hear it in Arabic. But people, even then, decide just to call it by a nickname, which is algebra. Algebra. And Al-Khwarizmi, who translates it, is the basis for our word algorithm. So it is in this meeting of Indic learning in the young Islamic world in Baghdad that these concepts of algebra and algorithms spread out from India into the Islamic world. And along with chess, another Indian game, which is traveling through Persia, when you play chess and you say checkmate, you're speaking Old Farsi. It's Shah Mat, the king is dead. So along with this, it's passing westwards from Sindh, where the copy of the Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta starts, to Baghdad, where it's translated by Al-Khwarizmi, who's from up here. Al-Khwarizmi is from Khwarazm. So he's Al-Khwarizmi, the guy from Khwarazm. He comes to Baghdad, translates it, and the book travels westwards through Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Spain, and by the 9th or 10th century, Christian monks are using those numbers in Barcelona for the first time. But, amazingly, for the next 200 years, it doesn't catch on. And Europeans are still writing MCV, CC, XXM. Try even giving your phone number in Roman numerals. It's a hell of a thing. And then something miraculous happens. Pisa decides to found a trading colony in Algeria. And the leading Pisan citizen who decides to set this up brings his son. The son studies this system, learns Arabic, learns this system in Algeria. And when he gets back to Pisa, age 18, and finds his friends still stumbling around with CCXVM, he writes a book called the Liber Abaci to explain it in Latin to Westerners. And who is this wunderkind who does this extraordinary book? Fibonacci. Leonardo of Pisa is brought up in Algeria and studies Al-Khwarizmi. So, there's the Liber Abaci. So this comes to the year of Frederick II. Luckily for all of us, Frederick II is the most enlightened king of his period. He hears about Fibonacci and he goes all the way to Pisa to meet him. Imagine Trump going to Philadelphia to meet some sort of... And he summons him to Castel del Monte, his perfectly geometric fortress in, which is, his bodyguard are all Arabs. His courtiers are often Byzantine. He's in correspondence with caliphs and divines in Morocco and all over. And he introduces Fibonacci to a Scotsman. There's an important part for the Scots in this. And Michael Scott comes from the same part of Scotland as I do, and he's a very important part of the story, because he reads Fibonacci's Liber Abaci, and he says, it's great, pal, but it's a wee bit theoretical. And so he says, you've got to add weights and measures, money conversion, currency conversion, usury, interest rates, all the practical stuff that merchants are going to need to set themselves up. And that's how we get the second edition of Liber Abaci, which is the text which goes all around Italy, leads to the founding of the Medici Bank, the beginning of the Italian banking revolution. It gets to Piero della Francesco sitting in San Sepolcro in Tuscany, where some of you may go for your holidays. He uses it to calculate perspective, and Renaissance painting is born. And when he dies, the 3 mathematical treatises that he has written about Fibonacci's mathematics and perspective are carried by his friend Fra Luca Pacioli to Milan, where he shares it with his flatmate, who's painting The Last Supper in Milan, and it's Leonardo da Vinci. So in 5 leaps, you get from Leonardo to Piero della Francesca to Fibonacci to Al-Khwarizmi to Brahmagupta to Aryabhatta. So that's how Indian numbers get to the West. Unfortunately, what happens next is they arrive in England and we get the East India Company. But that's another story for another day. Is it time for questions? Time is up. You have to come and have a fight with me about Aryabhatta herself later. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. I'll be signing books downstairs if anyone wants to.